Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining, and hello to John Colombo from the After Effects team. Thanks so much for hopping on with me and Kyle to talk about text style expressions in After Effects.
Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
So I understand that you have a preset that you've built for linking text style expressions and text animators, which is something that we've been working on in this whole video. And this is definitely something that's challenging to do, but really powerful with the new text style expressions. But before we get into that, I'd love to ask you, for people who don't know, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. So I come from a video and motion design background. I started as an assistant editor in 2005, became a motion designer 2009, 10-ish, after the financial crisis, when people didn't want to go shoot videos anymore. They'd rather just give me print assets and see if I can make a commercial from that. So I kind of started my journey there with After Effects and got really into expressions and scripting over time. So I was at a studio in Vegas for a while, Las Vegas, where I grew up, and then I worked at a hotel there as well, doing kind of big display motion graphics for SLS. And then over that time was kind of learning expressions and scripting. And then I went freelance for a while, did some work for Google, did some work for Amazon. And the whole time I was sort of kind of building up my own tools. And then while I was working for Amazon, I started releasing a bunch of scripts just on Gumroad, useful things that were from my own workflow. And that, I think, combined with some of my presence in the motion design community, got the attention of some of the folks on the After Effects team. And so they offered me a position. So I started there in 2018. My role is as a quality engineer, which is kind of a flexible role. I do everything from testing to kind of design consultation, because I have a ton of experience with After Effects, as well as building presets and going to big shows like Adobe Max and NAB and talking to customers. So that is kind of my position on the team, and I've been there for, gosh, what is it, 7 years now, I think. Yeah. And then you'll see me a lot in the Adobe Forums, actually. If you post a bug or an idea in there, it comes maybe not necessarily directly to my email, but I see them all day long and trying to respond to those, to as many of those as I possibly can.
Yeah, that's awesome. And your responses are definitely seen a lot in the forums and the motion design Slack. And you're always there to answer questions that people have. And it's super valuable that you do answer those community questions.
Yeah, it's nice to have sort of a record of those things. I always try and keep that in mind that, somebody a year down the road might have this same problem and want to come back and hopefully a Google search or something will bring up that thread, so that people can see what that answer is. And then the same thing applies to the bugs, honestly. I mean, sometimes, unfortunately, it takes a while for us to get a bug fixed because of the complications of it. And to me, it's important to have that record, there in the forums of, okay, yes, we do know about this issue. Hopefully people will also comment and vote on those so that we know how many more people are affected by it, because that also helps us with our prioritization.
I have had a question or two that I ended up Googling because I wasn't quite sure what the answer was. And I found my own post answering someone else's question. So having those there forever is good.
It is.
So outside of text style expressions, is there anything really fun that you've worked on the After Effects team that people might not know about?
Well, I mean, funny enough, the first thing I worked on was on the new expression engine, the JavaScript engine. So that was one of the first things that I worked on. I'd say, though, I mean, I probably have had the most fun making presets for After Effects when we started updating them a year or two ago. And I use them myself all the time because I know, like, oh, cool, I have a text box I can just grab, and it's so much simpler than trying to rebuild it with source-directed time every single time.
I recommend that 2D text box preset, and I use it all the time. Like, there are many instances where you need to build it from scratch yourself or use an effect stack, but that is such a convenient and well put together preset to quickly do a text box.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, that was one that I spent a lot of time on just because it's such a huge need for motion designers. And then the more recent ones that I had a lot of fun with kind of over the summer were the number counter presets. So there's 4 of them, and getting it all to work so that, any number format you can think of, whether it's, from the US or from Europe, making sure they're monospaced in any font using some expression/text animator magic to make that happen. But it's those are also really, really useful. And like I said, I had a lot of fun making them. So if there are any requests that anybody has, it's a fun challenge for me to try and come up with something that is, useful, but also very usable, for people at all skill levels. Not just for, advanced people, but also for people who are just getting started.
Well, maybe they should ask Nick and I first, and then you can make a much better version.
So, John, thank you so much for coming on to the show today. And I understand that you have a preset that you're willing to share with everyone for text style expressions and text animators. We'd love to talk to you about that and find out how we can use that preset.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've probably shared it with you here, but I'm going to go ahead and apply it to this text layer that I've set up here in After Effects. You probably can't see my menus, but I'm just grabbing the most recent animation preset from the animation menu. And you can see right away a text range selector showed up on this text layer, and it is restyling the text based on the characters. And all of this is driven by an expression down here in the timeline. Let's see, open up our source text here. Now, I promise it looks more intimidating than it really is.
It's a little scary, but that's all right.
I know. It's the code can be tough in After Effects. But up here at the top, all these are kind of doing is just pointing to different properties of the range selector, which is down here. We've got our animator 1 and our range selector. And the way that this works is that it looks directly at this based on menu here. And it changes how the text is grouped based on the same thing that the range selector is set to. So we could add, if we were to add an additional property here, like let's add position, scale it up a little bit, or not scale it, but move it up or down a little bit. Let's make that negative. There we go. So now we can see that the range selector and the styling that's coming from the style expressions are working together. And popping back to that expression, what this is doing after we kind of define all the stuff in the range selector that we want to use, I have these 4 different regular expressions here. Now, regular expressions are...
Regular.
Yeah, they're very regular. Even when it comes to like high-end coding, they're kind of looked at like, oh man, those are really complex and it's hard to tell what they're doing by looking at them. So I just notated on the side here what each one kind of does. But this is what is key to this expression, because the way that the range selector is looking at this text, right now we have it set to characters excluding spaces. So when it looks at each one of these characters, when it encounters a space, it is going to group those things together as one kind of index. Same thing as if it encounters a line break at the end, it's also going to group those things together. So in order to kind of emulate that, I have these regular expressions that break up the text in the same way that the range selector is breaking it up. So then once we have that, we take a look at our array and we say, oh, well, we want to grab the same value that is the based on control right here. So we ask what the based on control is, and we select one of our regular expressions. And then this bit here is kind of just saying, I want to make sure that all of our ranges stay within what they're supposed to. So we kind of look at how many we have, we look at the length and make sure that we're not exceeding that. And then really the kind of magic part about this that actually converts the range selector index into the per character index is this line down here, where we say, okay, let's take our index that we have and get all of the characters that are included in that. So the way that this would work is if I were to say, so up here, let me set our range selector so that we're only selecting this first word.
By the way, I love, some people probably don't know you can do this with text animators anyway, but I love that you set this up to be driven by a text animator so you can touch things in the viewer to move around the range.
Oh yeah. With me and expressions, I love writing them and it's a fun challenge, but my ideal experience is I write it and then I can not have to touch it again, and everything else I can do in the regular UI, whether it's a slider or dragging range selectors, whatever it is. I want to try and have that control because then it's a lot easier to manipulate it and to iterate and come up with new ideas and all that kind of stuff. So we've got this here, and what I'm going to do is I'll select these first 2 sets of words. And then, so what this is going to do is this says, okay, we want to get the first character all the way up into, we want to get the segment that, the range selector is looking at all the way up to that last character of the second word. But we do need to kind of collapse it down because with that space in there is not being counted by the range selector. And that's what this does, is this last part of the expression just sort of collapses that together. It says the range selector wants, 0 through 10, but the actual indexes is going to be 1 or 2 more than that because of those spaces. And this will map those two things together. And then for the styling at the end here, I had just added
the same way we were setting it up.
Exactly. Yeah. So I have set small caps and vertical scaling, and we could add, if we wanted to, we could add set fill color, and then I'll usually do like a hex to RGB. Do I still have that? Oh, good. I still have that hex code in there. Let's do that, and we add our mapped start and our number of characters, and now those are also going to be blue.
That's you easy.
So you can just go through and add whichever styles you need. And by the way, I don't know if you guys went over this or not, but in here, if you go to your text and styling, all of the things that you can change about the text are all listed in here. So if you want to go through and say, I need the caps, or I need the fill color, or kerning, or any of that stuff, that's all listed here. But it's also in the autocomplete. So you might be able to just say set and then start typing what you think it is, and it will fill it in for you.
Basically, the more elegant and powerful, scarier looking, but version of what we just went through. So it's really nice to be able to kind of see the other approach on it when you have a next level coding brain.
Yeah, because what's cool about this is that once I had kind of the basic pattern figured out, and Nick kind of saw me go back and forth of like, well, I might have to do it 2 different ways and combine them and all this stuff. But once I was able to kind of get the main meat of it together, getting all the other modes to work was not actually too hard. Be able to say, oh, I want it to be the first 3 lines, and then we can kind of offset that throughout it. Oh, it's looking a little funny because of the position, but zero that out. But this works for lines. It works for just the characters themselves, and it even works with the offset that's in there. So if you want to, be using that through kind of, almost everything about the range selector as you would usually use it works, but with the per character expressions.
Any other tips for somebody just grabbing this as a preset and using it?
I'd say it should be pretty straightforward. If you've got range selectors already on the text layer, maybe watch out for that. You might have to go to kind of to the top of the expression and make sure that the correct ones are being pointed to, because obviously the first one's going to always default to number 1. And if the preset also says number 1, then that's not going to work out. So maybe just check on that. But everything else should be pretty straightforward. You just need to add to the bottom what you want to be styled, and then you should be off to the races.
And the great thing about this preset is because it's all linked to the text animator, we can actually keyframe those values and manipulate the timing and the easing all in the timeline, just like we would normally animate keyframes.
Exactly.
That is so helpful.
Are there any other just tips, whether they're using our approach or your approach or, building their own stuff, just some tips for when you're working with these styling expressions?
Well, performance-wise, just be aware that setting the font is probably going to be the heaviest one that you might encounter. So there's that. But you can mitigate that a little bit by sort of pulling all the values you need into the expression up front as variables. I have an example of that in this expression right here, where I kind of say, well, the value, which is just the string that's on the text layer, I want to cache that to a variable to use later. And I found that this made this expression much, much faster, because every time that the expression calls value or dot value, it's having to kind of ask the code of After Effects, the C++ code, hey, what is that value? And if you're having to do that multiple times, that's going to slow things down. So if you cache it to a variable and use that instead, you've sort of made that data local, we would call it in computer science, where you've brought it into the expression you're working on. And so now it doesn't have to keep asking, over and over, what is that value? It's got it, and you can hold on to it. Then that's going to be big, not just for text expressions, but also for path expressions. When you're dealing with a ton of points, that's also going to be really important. Or if you're doing an expression that brings in a bunch of layer references, same thing. Cache all that stuff to a variable, so you're not having to call out and get the layers information again and again and again. And same thing with source rect at time. If you're calculating multiple source rects at time for different layers, make sure they're all cached to variables so that you don't have to keep calling it over and over.
A bunch of great bonus expressions tips here.
Yeah.
Yeah, performance optimization is definitely a challenge with writing expressions, and so those are super helpful for people to know. So something else is style expressions are really powerful, but you touched on how style expressions can be slower than just using text animators. So when people are considering doing text animation, when do you think that they should use style expressions, or when do you think they should just stick with regular old text animators?
Great question. I would say for things that are, if they're covered in the text animator itself, stick with those, because that's always going to be more performant than trying to do the style expressions. And you can stick with the UI. You don't have to be writing code to figure out what's going on with them. Looking here at our list of animators, which, oh good, it did show up. You have fill color and stroke color and things like that that are the same as if you were to do them on the text layer itself. But then anything that, things like tracking, that's another one that is kind of exists in both, but it's going to be easier to control from a text animator than it would be from the per character stuff. Same thing with I think the line spacing would it would correlate to, is it the leading? Yeah, the leading that would be in a multi-line text layer. Same thing. Sometimes you're going to need that more granular control that the per character expressions give you, and hopefully the preset will help you to use both at the same time. So you could say, oh, I want to have my tracking and my color controlled, or position and skew controlled through text animators, but I want to also change the typeface and maybe the width of the characters, the height of the characters using the per character expressions. One correlation I would make, or I guess the correlation would be the right word, would be as you're thinking about a layer that has its own content, like a piece of video, and then it has effects that are on top of that, and then it has maybe it's pre-composed that has different effects, and you kind of have an order of things there. It's the same with expressions in general, but with text expressions, when you're editing them with the per character expressions, you're editing effectively the source. You are changing what the characters themselves are. And then you can apply a text animator on top of that. So you could potentially blend a text animator color with a color being driven from the per character stuff. And then even on top of that, you would have your effects, because they would come later in the render graph and all that kind of stuff. So you can use that creatively to kind of mix and match things together to get either different behaviors that you need, as you're building a motion graphics template or some other kind of template, or you can then use it creatively to try and get effects that you wouldn't be able to get otherwise. You can do some cool stuff with, if you were to combine the width of characters, which when you do the width with the per character expressions, it pushes all the other characters out. So you can do some really cool stuff with that then you would mix with text animators later. So that's just a way to layer them and combine them can be really fun.
Yeah, Nick showed that example near the beginning of the tutorial, how the scale property works vastly differently between the style expressions and an animator, just in terms of how it's actually affecting all the rest of the characters and the layer boundaries and stuff like that. So good example of a time where the one you choose is kind of defined by what you need it to do.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them work differently, like set horizontal scale works differently as a text animator versus a style expression, but others work exactly the same, like set fill color. And exactly. I think it's great that we have options and the flexibility to just use both wherever we're more comfortable. And like you've said, there's different performance considerations to keep in mind if you choose to use style expressions.
And I would say too, if you're curious about whether you need one or the other, the style expressions are going to change the text layer exactly the same as everything over here in the properties panel or the character panel would do it. So if that's the behavior you want as you're playing with, the character width that are in here, this kind of, if you're playing with it there and it's giving you the look you want, you probably need the per character expressions versus a text animator.
Nice. That's a good sort of simple way to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of thing where if you're going to do it just because you can, I would say don't do that. But if it's what you need to do,
if you need to be able to bold a word or something, this is what.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and you do want it to be the correct bold. You don't want to be faking it with stroke or anything like that. You want it to actually be what the bold for that typeface is. So if you do need to set, the font to meet your brand guidelines or the design that you're trying to make, that's what you got to do. But do try to do those other tricks like, caching the value of the string and things like that, so that you're not adding extra layers of performance issues on top of what's already going to be slow. Something else you may want to avoid is writing loops in your expressions. There is a very nerdy concept in computer science called that describes the complexity of an algorithm. And what you really want is an algorithm that just looks in one place to get the value it needs. Not having to say, well, I'm going to go to the first one, then the second one, then the third one, and then you get all the way down the line to the one you need. You want to go just directly to it. And so when you're doing things in expressions, they're already kind of running in a loop all the time because you're evaluating every one on every frame. So you sort of already have that built-in loop. So you should try to use that as much as you can, where you want to say, hey, if I'm trying to get a specific marker, I want to use my current time to find that marker, or if I use my current time to find a keyframe, rather than looping through all the keyframes before the current time and getting to it, because that's going to take a lot longer. So that's why I say try to avoid loops when you can, because most of the time you're sort of duplicating what the expression is already doing under the hood. Just a different way of thinking about it.
That makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned that in expressions, your entire expression, including any loop or complex algorithm that you write, is going to run to completion on every frame. And so that is going to exponentially slow down your composition if it has to do a massive calculation on every single frame. Is there any way that people can prevent After Effects from re-rendering the expression on every frame?
So there is a trick where you put posterizeTime at the beginning of your expression with 0 as the value, where you basically just say, I want you to evaluate this once, and that's it. And that does work to speed up a lot of expressions. The kind of misnomer, though, is where the speed up is coming from. So the speed up is not so much like After Effects goes to evaluate the expression and then says, oh, I've done this already. It actually comes from the value being cached at I guess you would call a higher level, to say that, oh, I don't need to run this expression again because the value hasn't changed from what it was last time. So it's a little bit different than maybe how people are thinking about it, but that does work to speed up, what would be a really big expression or a really long running expression that you want to only have evaluate one time.
But of course, doesn't work if you need that value to change throughout the comp.
Yes, exactly. That's kind of the rub of that, is that if you tell it to only evaluate once, it's going to do it at the beginning of the comp, and that's it. It's not going to change over time, which most of the time you need that.
Right. So if you're not changing the value over time, you can add posterizeTime 0 at the top, and that will give you a big performance boost on your expressions because it's caching at that first frame.
Right.
Super helpful.
Since we're talking about it, could you do like posterizeTime 1 if you have something that changes, kind of gradually or changes much later? Would you get the same kind of performance savings doing something like that?
You would get a little, but then you would see jumps.
Right.
Like if the value is changing slowly over time, but the expression is only updating every second or every 2 or 3 seconds, then you'll see a jump in your value when that expression evaluation changes. So it won't end up being smooth.
Right. But the times that might work for something.
I mean, heck, if you're working at a low frame rate, maybe that would work out because it would just go along with kind of the aesthetic of what you've got going. I will say though, on that note, if you're adding posterizeTime to things to be like, ooh, posterizeTime 6 or something like that to maybe have like a hand-drawn look, or you're adding the posterizeTime effect to your comp, I might recommend just changing the frame rate of your comp. It's going to end up rendering a lot faster, and then you can always encode it at 24 or 30 when for your final deliverable. But you're going to work a lot faster if if your whole videos are already on 12s or 6s. You might as well not render all those extra frames.
But I like mixing the frame rates on different things. So
well, you could do that by having different comps with different frame rates that you're putting together.
Yeah, true.
At least for some elements. Sometimes you can't avoid it, but like we talked about, there's sort of an infinite amount of variability depending on what the project is.
And every little bit of performance that we can squeeze out of After Effects is helpful when we're working with tons of layers and tons of comps.
Absolutely.
So this preset is super helpful, and people can download it as an After Effects preset, install it to your effects and presets folder, and use it directly inside After Effects from the Effects and Presets panel. But this is such a useful preset, and the After Effects team recently added a bunch of other presets. Is there any chance that this or other text style expression presets would get added to the app by default?
That's actually something we've chatted about recently, even around this preset, of whether it would be a good addition to the app. The UX on it right now is not great in the sense that when you apply it, it kind of just subtly changes a few things, and it's not clear on how to necessarily take the next steps, which is something we could improve upon, maybe with some kind of a pseudo effect control or something like that that lets you manipulate it without having to go into the code. I actually personally created a bunch of the expressions, the presets that we recently added, things like the 2D text box and the number counters. So the UX around designing a preset when there isn't really a tutorial video or anything else to go along with it is really difficult. Trying to figure out how to make everything just immediately obvious is very hard. I mean, After Effects already has a ton of subtleties. So when you apply a preset and kind of all you have are the controls to understand what it does, that is really hard to convey a complex setup, something like an expression, like to go in here and then to, change out the methods that are being used here at the bottom. That's not obvious at all for a preset, but it is something that we are working towards improving. And maybe we could put some instructions in the Effect Controls panel or something. The other aspect of it is localization. Whatever we do has to work in all 9 languages that After Effects ships in. So that's, another consideration that we have when it comes to all these presets.
I'm sure that's easy. You're fine. Well, Nick, I don't know. Do we want to wrap this up by throwing a few of our requests at John and see if he is allowed to say anything about them? I mean, in the course of this, we've got some solutions here, but it'd be nice if something like that were just native as part of this. If you could just kind of call that out in a little expression function that would just be built in. Or I know one thing we called out is that justification needs to be the very bottom one right now, with just a little bit of a quirk that you have to know. I don't know. What thoughts did you have, Nick?
Yeah, I think that the quirks with set justification are definitely things that we can work around, but feel like things that should just work natively. The other one with set justification is if you ever use right to left text, like Arabic or Hebrew, those sort of Middle Eastern languages that write right to left by default, using set justification is backwards. It's flipped. If you write set justification left aligned, your text is really writing from the default, which is the right.
Yeah. It's we kind of went back and forth a little bit on that when the per character stuff was coming together. And it actually, the way that we ended up doing it mirrors the way that like the character panel does it and the properties panel do it as well. If I were to select these and change that, if we left align this and then I switch it to right align, you actually see that it also changes it to right align text because it's trying to do that. It's trying to show you what you see on screen. But under the hood, that actually hasn't changed. It's actually just saying this is the default alignment for the mode I'm in, either right to left or left to right. But it would be great to kind of iron out that issue. The challenge, as always, is like once it's out there in the wild, we can't change people's existing projects, obviously. And so we don't want to break those projects either. So then we have this whole challenge, and this is a lot of what we go through actually, is trying to make sure that, and because it's really important that previous projects continue to render correctly in the current version and in future versions. So we're always trying to come up with these different schemes to say, okay, how can we properly upgrade a project from an old format, or how can we just preserve the old thing and then use the new thing behind a preference or something like that? It's really difficult, and it's probably one of the things that makes things take as long as they do, is we have to be sure that we're preserving all that stuff. We can't just plow ahead and do the newest, maybe correct thing, because we've got to be sure that those older projects are not broken.
It's a lot of priorities to balance. Yeah.
That makes a ton of sense in building software used by, at this point, millions of people. But if you as a viewer think that this set justification change or some other update for textile expressions would be helpful, the best way to get those ideas to the team is in the Adobe Forums. So we'll have a few of those linked in the description so you guys can actually put your suggestions in a place where they'll be seen.
As proven by the fact that we have John on here. The team listens. They want to fulfill your requests to the best of their ability, but having you tell them clearly what it is that you want is a huge part of that.
Yes, exactly. We're constantly, there's always things in development. And so we're always looking at the forums or other places where people are posting feedback to say, hey, what can we glean from this of what we're currently working on and for what we're going to work on next, to try and plan all that stuff out. So please put your requests in the forums, submit your bugs in the forums. It's been, I think we switched to using the Adobe Forums for feedback 2.5 years ago, something like that. You'll see me in there a ton, talking to people and trying to either help with problems or get a bug filed so that we are aware of it and so I can hand it off to an engineer or to another team maybe. But yes, please, please, please file those requests, because if we don't know about it, we can't fix it, and we're constantly testing. But After Effects and all the different use cases for it is just a massive, massive number of variables to account for. We're always improving it. But when we hear about your workflow, your specific workflow, and how something might not be working, whether you need a feature request or whether it's a bug, we're always looking at that stuff, and we desperately need you to report things so that we can make things better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a bunch of sense. One feature request that I would love to see added to textile expressions in the future is to be able to create a style that contains a bunch of methods and then just apply that to a range. Something like setStyleAt, where we predefine a style and apply it. I think that would be really helpful.
I would personally love to see that too, so that you could do more powerful things with less code. And being able to define a style and reuse it is something that anybody building a template would use all the time. So that's a great request. And I don't know if you've made it in the forums already or not, but please do, because then we can start kind of gathering votes on that and starting a conversation around it too. That's something I guess I don't see as much in the forum that I'd like to see more of. And I try to prompt it where I can, is just to say like, hey, this is a great request. What, how would it work in your workflow? Give me more details about why this is important to you. And it's something, sometimes I'll also bring up like, oh, maybe this could be done this other way. And we have a conversation around why that way might be better, might not be better, might not be ideal, and that kind of stuff. That having that conversation in the Adobe forums where I can, grab one of my engineer coworkers and say, hey, look at this, that, this is something that could be exciting to work on. That's really important.
Maybe a good summary there is, if you find something that you agree with as a feature you also want, upvoting is great, but adding your own thoughts and clarifying how you would use that is really helpful, because as we kind of talked about, like a lot of people end up using After Effects differently, even though everyone probably thinks everyone else uses it exactly the same way they do. Right. So giving you folks some diversity of opinions on these things is probably really helpful to figuring out how they should actually work.
It is hugely helpful. Well, one thing I'll say recently is another coworker of mine recently came up with sort of a framework for thinking about people's use of After Effects, and it was really cool. He kind of was saying it's less like picking a character in Mario Kart and more like building a character in an RPG, of like, what skills do you have? And in After Effects you could have plus 10 in compositing and only 2 in expressions, or plus 20 in expressions and like 5 in, I don't know, shape layers or something, like and it's really more of that. Like you kind of you build up your own After Effects character over time, based on the types of projects you do, maybe the types of people you work with, or the plugins and scripts that you bring with you. Like all that kind of stuff kind of factors into your unique use of After Effects. I don't think any After Effects user really fits into like a specific box of like, oh, this is exactly what they need and what they use all the time, because it's just such a varied tool and a varied industry, honestly.
It really is the Swiss Army knife that people build onto with all the scripts and panels and plugins and even presets, just like this.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else coming down the pipe for textile expressions that people should look out for in the future?
So we're still improving on it and doing fixes and things like that as issues come up. I don't know that there's anything in the very near future for it. We're looking at things like some of the requests you guys have made as improvements that could come down the road. But as always, we're constantly making improvements to the app that go into the beta builds that we push out pretty regularly. So check those out. There's some exciting stuff coming within the next few weeks and months. So keep an eye on that.
Awesome. Okay, this was great. Thank you so much for joining, and thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge with everyone. This has been a super helpful deep dive into your knowledge of After Effects and textile expressions. And it's so awesome that you're giving away this preset for people to use.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been really fun.
Awesome. We did it.
Thanks a lot, John.